We are counting down the top 10 matches in Summerslam history, and this week we have arrived at match number 2. There was never any doubt this match would be on this list. I'm sure it's probably number 1 on a lot of people's lists as the greatest SummerSlam match of all time. Like, Hogan-Andre would be considered the most iconic of all the WrestleMania matches by a lot of people. This is sort of, in a way, the Hogan-Andre of all the SummerSlams. Just that big, epic match in front of a record crowd that's remembered and celebrated years later. And if you believe the 78,000 attendance figure for WrestleMania 3 and not the 93,001 that they publicly gave, this would have been the legitimate highest attended WWE show of all time, up until some of the more recent WrestleMania Stadium shows. They had 79,000 plus, right around 80,000 in Wembley Stadium for a rare main event for the Intercontinental Championship, pitting Bret the Hitman Hart against his brother-in-law, the British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith, with Bulldog's wife, Bret's sister, Diana, torn between the two men in her life from SummerSlam 1992. Now, in 1992, to give some backstory here, WWE was suffocating under the weight of scandal after scandal after, sex scandals and drug scandals, steroid scandals. Hulk Hogan took time off after WrestleMania. He had been their biggest box office attraction for many years up to this point. Business was really bad, domestically, for WWE. This show was originally booked, or going to be booked, for the Capitol Center in Washington, D.C., a 20,000-seat arena. But there was a lot of concern and a lot of question about whether or not they would even be able to fill the place. That's how bad business was getting. So they turned to Europe, where, as bad as business was for them in the States, business was booming. In the UK and other places, Germany, overseas, they were doing gangbusters in that part of the world. And so at the very end of May, the decision was made to move SummerSlam from DC to Wembley Stadium in London, England, which has, or had, maybe it still does, a capacity of up to 85,000 people. But not only moved the location of the show, but moved the date as well. Instead of August 31st, the show would now take place on August 29th, and it would air on a 2-day tape delay. So they would keep the original air date, but they would tape the show 2 days in advance. Primarily because of just how expensive it was to, it would have cost them a lot of money to do that show live from a location overseas. If they thought they would be able to sell out the Capitol Center, though, they probably would never have moved the show to Wembley in the first place. But this was more of a move they felt they had to make. And it sounds very counterintuitive, right? When you think about it, like, business is bad, and we can't sell out a 20,000-seat arena, so I know, let's move the show to an 80,000-seat stadium. But that just illustrates how different business was for them back then between the two countries. And it was a very strange show in that it was the first in years to not feature Hulk Hogan. Although, if you believe Hogan, I was telling Hogan fables earlier on the show this week from his interview with Austin, but if you believe Hogan, the song Hulkster in Heaven was about a sick Make-A-Wish kid that he met in the UK and who he got a ticket for to see him wrestle at SummerSlam at Wembley. And during his match, Hogan looked out into the crowd. He saw the empty seat that was meant for this kid, and he knew instantly it meant that the child was dead. And that inspired him to dedicate the song to him in his honor. Of course, Hogan wasn't even on the show, but maybe in the Upside Down or some alternate reality, Hulk Hogan did in fact wrestle at SummerSlam 92. So, no Hogan. Ric Flair, one of their other top stars, had no match. He and Mr. Perfect were involved in the whole Ultimate Warrior Macho Man storyline, but Flair did not have a promoted match on this show. He wrestled El Matador on the SummerSlam special that aired a week before the pay-per-view, but he had no match on the actual pay-per-view. Instead, he interfered in the championship match. And they closed the show. Here's the other odd thing that they never did. I mean, they would do it at house shows back when the, in the 80s, they would have 2 or 3 crews going in different parts of the country on the road. You'd have your A crew, your B crew, and your C crew. Hogan was always the A team, but you might have a B crew that has a show that is being headlined by the IC title, since the WWF champion would have been in another city. So they did used to do that. But in terms of a pay-per-view back then, you won't find a pay-per-view that ended with the Intercontinental Championship headlining. This was a first. This was very unique, very strange. And had this pay-per-view taken place anywhere else in the world, like DC, this match would not have closed out that show. It would have been Savage and the Warrior. But they were in the UK, and it was perfect. It was the perfect excuse to put the hometown hero in the main event. So I'm fascinated when I read up on what was the original plan, what was the original idea, what was going on, or I go back and I read old newsletters and old magazines and read what was going on at the time. It's like when I tell you guys to jump on RSPW and the old Google groups and look up some old internet message board postings from the 80s and the 90s, the early 2000s. It's fascinating what people were talking about in real time at that time. And one of the interesting things about this show is that had this event taken place at the Capitol Center in Washington, as it was originally going to, Bret Hart and the British Bulldog would not have even been on the card. The Intercontinental Championship match at SummerSlam 92 was going to be, and would have been, Bret Hart defending against Shawn Michaels. And I wonder, and this is just me speculating, that if they did Bret and Shawn, I wonder if it would have been a ladder match. Because it was around this time that Bret went to Vince and said, I got this great idea for a match, let me show you. And Vince let Bret show him one night. It was him and Shawn, and I think it's the match that you can find on some Coliseum, I forgot which Coliseum video it is, it might be Smack 'em Whack 'em, but on one of the Coliseum videos at least, is the very first WWE ladder match between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels for the Intercontinental Championship. And it's a good match. It's not, anything outstanding or anything. But the idea was, let's show Vince in execution what this concept is like. Because Bret worked a whole bunch of ladder matches against Dynamite and people in the Stampede territory. Ladder matches go back at least to the 70s. It's not some kind of new creation, but it was Bret who brought it to WWE and doesn't really get credit for that. Everyone thinks of Shawn and Razor, but really it was Bret Hart. And I wonder, they did that match in July of 92. Bret won. Wasn't televised. If that was a dry run for what would have been a ladder match at SummerSlam between Bret and Shawn. That we'll never know. But that was going to be the match between those two guys, and Shawn would have won the Intercontinental Championship most likely. Bret probably still would have gone on to become WWF champion like he did in the fall. Because the whole idea was that Shawn was going to get the belt. Shawn was going to get the IC belt at some point in the not-too-distant future. And so instead of winning it at SummerSlam, he ended up winning it on that Saturday Night's Main Event show in October. He beat the Bulldog for it before Bulldog got fired. Had Bulldog not been fired, for the human growth hormone stuff, I would think it's very likely he would have dropped that title to Shawn either at the Royal Rumble in 93 or at WrestleMania 9. So in Diana Hart's first book, Diana Hart came out with a book, Broken Hearts, many years ago. And it is worth noting that that book was riddled with so many inaccuracies, it was pulled from print. The lawyers had it pulled. They did not want to be sued. You can thank Owen's widow, Martha, for that. She either sued or threatened to sue, and anyway, the book got pulled. But in the book, Diana claimed that she was almost pulled from the match because she was a very big part of that whole storyline involving Bret and Bulldog. And she was kind of caught in the middle between with her brother and her husband, and I don't want to see them fight, and they won't talk to each other, and she's on television getting all emotional and doing this acting job and trying to cry, and she was a very big part of the storyline. Well, in her first book, Diana claimed that she was almost pulled from the match. She wasn't even sure WWE would want her to fly out to the UK for the match. Reason being, according to her, they were trying to bring in Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, to raise the winner's hand at the end of the match. And she said that Ferguson ended up getting involved with some bad publicity around that time. She doesn't say what the bad publicity was. I checked to see if there was any kind of big controversy involving the fine Duchess at the time. And I don't even think I've heard her name mentioned in so many. I know she was doing those Weight Watchers commercials for a while, Sarah Ferguson. But anyway, so I looked it up, and the only thing I could find, and ironically it was right around that time in August of 1992, there was a whole controversy because there were nude photos of her that leaked. She was sunbathing, probably on a beach somewhere, or maybe at her home, I don't know. And somebody leaked those photos. Not her fault, but somebody leaked those photos. She was sunbathing, topless. That's all I could find. That doesn't really strike me as being a huge controversy, but maybe back then it was. I don't know. And so suddenly Diana was back in the match. Now, the other issue was that Davey Boy hurt his knee. In the build-up, in the lead-up to this event in July, he hurt his knee in a match. And they didn't know how serious it was, but he had to take the next several weeks off to make sure that he was ready in time for the match, because it's a big deal. This was going to be the main event of this show. Now, in his book, Bret Hart says that he could not get Davey on the phone in the days leading up to their match at SummerSlam. He was trying desperately to reach him. He tried to reach him before they each flew out to England for the show. He got his sister on the phone and said, "Where is Davey?" And all she would tell him is that he was hanging out with Jim. Jim being Jim Neidhart. And when Bret finally got to Neidhart, Jim told him that the Bulldog was on the flight over, high as a kite, because he had been up all night with him, smoking crack. That's nice. So they get to Wembley. There is an entrance rehearsal the night before SummerSlam. And Davey Boy admits to Bret he had been up smoking crack for weeks with Jim Neidhart, and he had not slept at that point in 2 days. 2 days straight, he had not slept, and now he was scared to death. He should be scared to death of dying, but he was scared to death of just not being able to do the match, not being able to remember his spots, perform. What am I going to do? And Bret says that he told him, "Don't worry about it. Just follow my lead, and you will be fine." He had the entire match, Bret did, mapped out, move for move, just like Randy Savage did with Ricky Steamboat at WrestleMania 3. So we get to SummerSlam 1992, and they are interviewing fans before the show outside at Wembley Stadium, and they're asking them, who do you think is going to win, Bret Hart or the British Bulldog? And they're probably asking them this for all the different matches on the card. They find this one little kid, this one little Brit, who gives us this famously unforgettable quote.
The British Bulldog's gonna win, whether he wants to or not.
Yes. The British Bulldog is going to win whether he wants to or not. Vince McMahon is going to go to him in the back and say, "Davey, you're going to go over on Bret. We're going to put the championship on you." And Davey is going to go, "No, Vince, no. I don't want to win." And Vince is going to go, "You're going to win, damn it." Yes, that quote will forever live in infamy. I would love to know where that kid is today. Bulldog comes out for the match. He's got Lennox Lewis with him. London's own Lennox Lewis carrying the Union Jack on his way down to the ring. A few minutes into the match, Bret says that Davey was totally gassed out. He grabbed him in a side headlock, and Davey said, "Bret," this is the other classic quote, by the way. Davey just goes to Bret, "Bret, I'm fooked. I can't remember anything. I'm fooked." And so Bret carried him as best he could for the next 25 minutes. And look, I take Bret at his word on this, but when you watch the match back, look, you got to give credit to Bulldog too, because Bulldog, it wasn't like he looked like he was completely out of gas. He held up his end just fine. You could see spots where he looked very tired, and there were a lot of rest holds in this match. And a lot of chin locks, and I have to assume that was to give Bret a chance to sort of convey to Bulldog what the next spot was going to be if he really was as messed up as Bret claims. At one point in his book, after Bret kicked out of the Bulldog's running power slam finish, he said that Davey had this look on his face like he had realized that Bret had just put together a masterpiece of a match for them. And the one thing about Bret Hart, and I love him to death, he's my all-time favorite, is that Bret Hart's biggest fan was, is, and always will be Bret Hart. And he would often talk about himself and his work in a way that would rub some people the wrong way. And I know that the Clique members would mock him for it and all that. Because nobody likes a braggart, right? Even if you have good reason to brag, you let other people do the bragging for you. You let other people talk about you. Nobody wants to hear you talk about yourself. If you're that good, other people will do the talking for you. So, yeah, Bret has an ego. A lot of these guys have egos. All the top stars have had egos. Bret was not immune to that either. Bret had a very big ego, but he really was a master storyteller in between the ropes. He backed it up in the ring. There was one spot in the match where Bulldog was outside. Bret did a plancha out over the top rope, and Bulldog was not in the right position. He was not even looking up and facing Bret. He was like leaning on the apron. He didn't brace himself to, catch Bret in the fall or anything like that, and Bret nearly destroyed him on the landing, but he ended up okay. Later on, Bret tried for a suplex. Davey blocked it. He hoisted Bret up into the air to put him, he was going to place him on the top rope. Right? We've seen this. We see this spot in almost every match. You pick the guy up in a suplex position, you plant him on the top rope, you climb up, you hit a superplex. So that's what he was going for here, but Bret says that Davey almost castrated him. That's the word he used. He said he almost castrated him. If he landed half an inch over, Bret's little hitman would have been excellently executed. Just the way that he, on top of that metal strut when he dropped him, it was a little too close for comfort. So they had constant cuts throughout this entire match to Diana Hart in the crowd looking very concerned, nearly in tears. Wembley is just going crazy for the British Bulldog. It's just this great atmosphere for this match. Much like his SummerSlam match the year before with Mr. Perfect, both guys are flat on their backs, and Bret grabs Bulldog's legs. He starts twisting them to apply the sharpshooter from his back. From his back, he is twisting and contorting Bulldog's legs and trying to get him in position for the sharpshooter. Finally, he does. Bulldog struggles. He's in agony. He crawls to the ropes. Finally, he makes the ropes. Bret says, "It's time to go home." Whips Bulldog into the ropes. Or actually, Bulldog whipped him into the ropes. Bret comes off with a sunset flip. Davey falls forward, trapping Bret's legs for the 1, 2, 3. And the visual of Wembley Stadium exploding is something that I will never forget. Like the visual of Hogan slamming Andre in Pontiac, it's just sort of seared into my brain until the day that I die. Bret is upset. He refuses to shake hands with Davey Boy. At first, they're kind of playing it up for drama. He threatens to leave. He has second thoughts. Walks over, shakes his hand after all. Diana gets into the ring. She hugs her brother. She hugs her husband. They all celebrate together. The pyro goes off. It's this great finale to the biggest SummerSlam of all time. And one thing I have taken notice of, I have noticed that a lot of Bret's matches, his biggest matches, did not end with a sharpshooter. They did not end with a finishing maneuver. This match being one example of that, right? Bulldog leans forward and traps Bret's legs, pins him 1, 2, 3. That was a unique finish. Roddy Piper against Bret Hart, WrestleMania 8. Yeah, right? That was the kicking off the turnbuckle while Roddy had him in the sleeper and kind of turning it into a pinning combination. Bret did the same thing with Steve Austin in their first match at the Survivor Series in '96. The victory roll that he won with over Bam Bam Bigelow in the finals of the King of the Ring in '93. Even better than that, he tried the same move the year after that at WrestleMania with his brother. He went for the victory roll. You think that was an accident? He knew that people remembered that. He had just used that move to win the King of the Ring the year before, and now he wants people to think he's going to win again with a victory roll. Well, this time at WrestleMania, Owen had him scouted. He sat down, trapped Bret, his shoulders to the mat, and pinned him. Even the rematch with Davey Boy. They had another match at In Your House in 1995 that was excellent. Bret used a La Magistral Cradle for the win, which was actually a move that was taught to him by a young Chris Jericho. That's a whole separate story. But that's one of the things that I love so much about Bret's matches. It wasn't always, big boot, big leg drop. It wasn't always kick, wham, stunner, rock bottom people's elbow, choke slam, tombstone. He had his 5 or 6 moves of doom that people love to talk about. But he mixed it up on the finishes enough to really keep things interesting. So, coming out of SummerSlam, Davey Boy was one of the top stars in the company. He had just got this huge win at Wembley in front of 80,000 people. He was the second biggest champion in the company. Bret Hart, I think, was feuding or about to feud with Papa Shango or something at the time. And they were very serious. The company was, at this point, more serious than at any other point in their history about drug testing and steroid testing, because they had the heat on them from the federal government. They were being watched. And because of all that government heat and government oversight and fears of what it could lead to, they had to be more stringent about things. They came to find out that Davey, I think he was having human growth hormone imported, if I'm remembering the story correctly, from overseas. Him and the Warrior both. That's why they both were fired. So Bulldog gets fired, but not before dropping the championship to Shawn Michaels on Saturday night's main event in October of 92. Bret, meanwhile, is anointed the chosen one, because all the steroid stuff, they want to get away from the same familiar faces. Yeah, Ric Flair doesn't have that same build that a guy like Hogan and Warrior had, but he's part of the old guard. They want to get their championship on a new guy, on a good wrestler who could represent them and not be, this walking kind of neon billboard for drug use. Even though Bret in his book admits that he tried steroids as well, he didn't look like the type who was abusing steroids. And he was a reliable guy. They knew they could put him out there and he could have great matches with almost anybody. And so he was the guy who they ended up putting the championship on. And that solidified him over time as a main event player.